crack the code behind one of modern history's biggest economic puzzles, and we'll be using Kenichi Ono's The History of Japanese Economic Development as our guide. Okay, so let's just dive right into the central mystery we're investigating today. How on earth did a feudal, isolated nation transform into a global industrial powerhouse, seemingly overnight? I mean, we're talking about this incredible leap from a samurai society to an industrial giant. It's a feat that honestly baffled the entire world. So, to really find the answer, we can't just stick to the usual story, the one about post 19th century modernization. We've got to dig a lot deeper into Japan's past. Now, the common story you always hear credits the arrival of the West. Commodore Perry's black ship sailing in during the 1850s. That's supposed to be the spark. But is that really the whole picture? What our source suggests is that the real story actually started centuries before any of that happened. Okay, so let's hit rewind. We're going to go way back to the Edo period. We're talking 1603 all the way to 1867. Now, this was this long era of peace under Tokugawa rule that, and you're going to see this, was actually surprisingly modern. And this is what's so fascinating. Long before any industrial technology arrived from the West, Japan had already developed these 7 crucial foundations for a modern economy. I mean, look at this list. Political stability, advanced agriculture, unified national markets, a wealthy merchant class, even a high level of education. The groundwork, it turns out, was already there. And this graph right here, it illustrates the point perfectly. I mean, just look at the data. Even before modern machines were in the picture, rice production, which is a great way to measure productivity, was consistently growing faster than the amount of land being farmed. So what does that tell you? It shows a society that wasn't stagnant at all. It was already becoming more productive, more dynamic, all on its own. Okay, so if all those foundations were already in place, then what was it? What made Japan's society so unique? And this leads us to an even deeper question, one that's about the very structure of Japanese history and its geography. So to get a handle on this, we really have to look at Japan's geography. And there's this really fascinating theory from a scholar named Umasao Tadayo that helps us build on what we've found so far. Umesao's idea is called the ecological view of history, and honestly, it's a pretty radical take. He argued that if you look at a map, Japan, just like Western Europe, is on the periphery of the huge Eurasian continent. And because of that location, it was basically insulated from constant invasion. This allowed its society to just evolve, cumulatively, without being constantly disrupted. So the takeaway is, Japan wasn't backward at all. Its location just let it develop organically, kind of like Britain did. But of course, not everyone agrees with that. There's always another side, right? You've got other scholars like Tominaga Kenichi who argue the complete opposite. They say Japan's traditional culture was actually a huge obstacle that had to be overcome, and that this created a really deep conflict during its push to modernize. And this debate, this tension between these two ideas, it actually brings us to the core concept that I think really helps unlock this whole mystery. It wasn't just about what Japan already had, it was about how it brought in new ideas. And that crucial idea is something called translative adaptation. So what is that? Well, it's the process of selectively borrowing foreign ideas and systems, but, and this is the important part, then reinterpreting and modifying them to fit the local context, the local needs, and the local values. Think of it like a master chef, right? They take a foreign recipe, but then they expertly swap in local ingredients to create something totally new, totally unique. And Megawa Keiji puts it perfectly. He said, "The essence of what has been called modernization is the adaptive acceptance of Western civilization under the persistent form of the existing culture." So you see, Japan's success wasn't about just copying the West. Not at all. It was about having a society that was already mature enough to absorb, reinterpret, and really truly own those changes. All right, so let's put all these pieces together. Let's bring all these clues to the table and finally solve the mystery of the Japanese economic miracle. So when you look at this long, uninterrupted evolution, we're going from ancient emperors all the way through the incredibly dynamic samurai era. What you get is a unique kind of societal resilience and flexibility. And that was the deep historical foundation that was absolutely necessary for the modern age. So here's the crucial takeaway. Japan entered the modern era with this incredibly rare and powerful 1-2 punch. First, you had this vibrant, competitive entrepreneurial class that had just emerged organically over centuries. And second, you had a government that was capable of acting like a useful coach and a promoter, not some heavy-handed controller. This dual strength, it was a direct result of that unique history we've been talking about. And this leaves us with a final, and I think pretty provocative thought. If a nation's unique, long-term history can give it such a crucial head start, well,
to the deep dive. Today we're looking at a puzzle that I think a lot of people assume they know the answer to. But the more you look at the pieces, the less they seem to fit. Talking about Japan.
Right.
Specifically, how a small, agrarian, isolated island nation managed to become the first non-Western country to fully industrialize.
It's a massive historical anomaly. I mean, if you were a betting person in, say, 1850, you would not have put your money on Japan.
No way.
You've got a country that had been basically closed off from the world for over 2 centuries. The economy is almost entirely based on rice farming. And then, in what is just a blink of an eye, historically speaking, they're defeating European empires in war and flooding the global market with their textiles.
Right, and the standard answer, the one I feel like I learned in school, is just that they copied the West.
The copycat theory.
Yeah, they saw steam engines, realized they were behind, and just, carbon copied everything from Britain and Germany. Or the other version is that it was some kind of miracle that happened after World War II.
That's the popular narrative, the miracle. But today we're looking at The History of Japanese Economic Development by Kenichi Ono. And his argument is that there was no miracle.
Okay.
And more importantly, that copycat idea is actually dead wrong. If they had just tried to copy the West, they almost certainly would have failed.
That's a bold claim.
Yeah.
So if they didn't copy and it wasn't magic, what was it?
Ono argues it was a very specific 2-part process. He uses 2 key phrases that we're going to lean on today: internal evolution and translative adaptation.
Internal evolution and translative adaptation.
Okay.
The second one's a bit of a mouthful, but let's start with the first one. Internal evolution. That implies something was happening inside Japan before the Western ships ever showed up. But wasn't the Edo period, that long stretch from 1603 to 1867, wasn't that basically a time where Japan just stood still?
That is the big misconception. We see isolation and we think stagnation.
Right. Samurai, shoguns, nothing changes.
But Ono, and he's drawing on scholars like Umesao Tadao, argues that this isolation was actually an incubator. Umesao has this really fascinating ecological view of history. He compares Japan to the United Kingdom.
Okay, because they're both islands. That seems a little basic.
Well, it starts with geography, but it's really about the consequences of that geography. Both Japan and the UK are islands sitting just off the coast of a massive continent, Eurasia.
Sure.
Japan is near China and India. The UK is near continental Europe. Umesao says this is like a Goldilocks zone.
How so?
They were close enough to these huge civilizations to import hide culture, Buddhism, kanji, Roman law, whatever it is. But they were just far enough away that they weren't constantly being invaded.
Ah, okay, so they weren't being reset all the time.
Exactly. Unlike, say, Poland, where you have armies marching through every 50 years and just burning down all your institutions, Japan had stability.
And that's key.
264 years of peace under the Tokugawa shogunate. Because society wasn't being constantly rebooted by war, it allowed for these really complex social and economic structures to evolve organically. It wasn't stagnant, it was just developing internally.
Okay, so they have peace. But peace doesn't automatically create an economy. You said it was based on rice. How do you get from rice farming to, a modern banking system?
This is where it gets really clever, and it all ties back to how the shogun kept control. There was a system called Sankin Kotai.
Alternate attendance?
Right. The shogun in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, he didn't trust the local feudal lord.
Which sounds incredibly expensive.
It was foods, they need inns, they need food, and most importantly, they need cash.
Why cash? Couldn't they just pay for everything in rice?
Well, you can't exactly lug tons of rice hundreds of miles to pay for a room at an inn. It's just not portable. So the daimyos had to sell their tax rice to merchants in big cities like Osaka to get gold and silver, to get cash.
I see where this is going. This forces a shift from a barter economy to a monetized economy.
Precisely. And who benefits from that? The merchants. The samurai are spending. The merchants are collecting. This allowed for this huge accumulation of capital in the private sector.
So families like Mitsui and Sumitomo,
who are still corporate giants today. Yeah, they got their start right here.
Hmm.
So by the time the West arrives, Japan already has a unified national market, a road network, a credit system, and this really wealthy merchant class ready to invest.
That explains the money. But what about the people? You can have rich merchants, but you can't run a factory if your average worker is an illiterate peasant.
And that's the other pillar of this internal evolution. The education level in Edo Japan was shockingly high. There were thousands of private elementary schools called terakoya,
So what were they teaching?
the 3 R's, reading, writing, and the abacus for math.
And how did that compare to, say, Europe at the time?
It was comparable to, and in some regions even better than, literacy rates in London or Paris in the mid-19th century. And we're not just talking about the elites. Farmers needed to read manuals to increase their crop yields.
Right, and merchants obviously needed math.
So when industrialization finally arrived, the Japanese workforce wasn't starting from zero. They were literate, they were numerate, and they were disciplined.
So the engine was basically built. It was sitting there, idling. But it was still an engine designed for a feudal society. Then 1853 happens. Commodore Perry shows up with the black ships.
The catalyst. And you have to remember, the Industrial Revolution had been raging in Europe for decades. Japan was completely unaware of how far behind they had fallen.
Until these massive American steamships
Yeah.
with huge cannons just sail right into Edo Bay.
It wasn't just a trade mission, it was an existential threat. The Japanese leadership looked at those ships and realized, if we don't modernize right now, we are going to be colonized.
That fear must have been the ultimate driver.
Mhm.
But this brings us to your second key term, translative adaptation.
Right.
Because the reaction could have been, panic and try to become American,
Mhm.
or the opposite, reject everything foreign and fight them with swords.
And there were factions arguing for both, but the path Japan actually took, and this is a concept from the scholar Michael Kiji, was translative adaptation.
Okay, so what does that mean in practice?
The core idea is that you don't just passively accept a foreign system. You take the foreign thing, a constitution, a factory, a school, and you strip it down. You figure out how it works, and then you rebuild it to fit your own indigenous culture and your own needs.
So it's more like editing than just overwriting your own culture.
Exactly. The slogan was Wakan Yorsai Western Technology, Japanese Spirit. But actually implementing this was messy. The shogunate completely collapsed under the pressure, which led to the Meiji Restoration in 1868.
I've always found the Meiji Restoration a bit confusing politically.
Yeah.
I mean, they restore the emperor, which sounds like going backwards.
Well, the emperor was the symbol, the rallying point, but the actual government was run by a group of young, pretty low-ranking samurai from the domains that had led the rebellion.
Yeah.
And it wasn't some rigid dictatorship. The source calls it flexible politics. They were pragmatists. Their only goal was fukoku kyohei.
Enrich the country, strengthen the military.
And they argued constantly about the best way to do it.
Let's talk about the enriching part. This is where we get into the nuts and bolts. Most people probably think industrial power means steel and coal. But the sources point out silk is a luxury good. How do you...
Factories, Japan had to buy machines from the West. To buy machines, you need dollars or pounds.
Because nobody trusts the yen yet.
Exactly. So Japan had to export something the West actually wanted. The US economy was booming at the time, and American women really wanted silk stockings.
So the silk trade was basically a giant cash cow to earn the hard currency they needed to buy heavy machinery.
Precisely. Silk earned the cash, cotton built the industry. And that's a crucial distinction. The silk industry was mostly traditional farmers raising cocoons in their attics. It spread wealth to the villages. But the cotton industry, that was the training ground for modern Japanese management.
And this is where we see translative adaptation in action, right on the factory floor. There's that incredible story of Yamanobe Takeo.
Yamanobe is a legend. So the Osaka Spinning Company wants to build a state-of-the-art textile mill. They send Yamanobe to Manchester, England, the heart of the global textile industry,
To learn how it's done.
to learn how it's done. But it's not easy. I mean, he's this guy from a backward Asian country, and nobody wants to hire him. He eventually finds a trainee spot, studies the machines, and then he comes back.
But he doesn't just build a British factory in Osaka.
No, and if he had, he probably would have failed. He looked at the variables. In Britain, capital money for machines was cheap, but labor was relatively expensive. In Japan, it was the complete opposite. Capital was scarce and expensive, but labor was cheap.
So how do you adapt your strategy to that reality?
You run the machines harder. The British mills ran single shifts. Yamanobe installed electric lights, which was super high tech at the time, and ran the machines 24 hours a day with 2 shifts of workers.
So he's reducing the cost per unit of that expensive machinery by just using it twice as much.
Exactly. Maximize the return on your most expensive asset.
Brilliant.
And he made a technical change too. The British machines were designed to use expensive, long staple American cotton. Yamanobe figured out that if they just tweaked the machines a little, they could use cheaper, short staple cotton from China.
So he cut costs on raw materials and maximized the uptime of the machinery. That is the adaptation.
And the result was that the Osaka Spinning Company was massively profitable. They eventually beat the British mills at their own game. But notice the pattern. He went to the source.
They were. At one point in the 1870s, the Ministry of Industry was spending a huge chunk of its budget just on salaries for these foreigners. Some of them were paid more than the Japanese prime minister.
Wow.
But the government viewed it as tuition. Implicit goal of learn everything this person knows, then we can fire them and you can take their job.
Ruthlessly efficient.
It had to be. They just couldn't afford to keep them on the payroll forever.
Okay, so we have the internal foundation from the Edo period. We have this smart adaptation of technology and a booming textile industry. It kind of sounds like a straight line to success.
It does, but the source material has a whole section called The Shadows of Modernization. We need to talk about the cost of all this.
It definitely wasn't a straight line. There were massive failures. We talked about adaptation. Well, sometimes they forgot to adapt. The Yawata Steelworks is the classic example.
This was the government's big push into heavy industry, right? Steel for ships and guns.
Exactly. They decided they needed their own steel supply. So they turned to Germany, which had the best tech. They bought a massive German blast furnace design, hired German engineers, set it all up,
Right.
and they turned it on, and it just stopped working. The furnaces kept getting clogged. They were losing unbelievable amounts of money.
What was the problem? Did they build it wrong?
No, they built it perfectly for Germany. The furnace was designed for high quality German coke. Japanese coal has a much higher ash content. The German design just couldn't handle it.
So they copy-pasted the hardware without checking if it was compatible with the local software, basically, the local resources.
That's a great way to put it. The German engineers actually gave up and went home. It was left to Japanese engineers to experiment for years, redesigning the furnace, changing the airflows, until they finally got it to work with Japanese coal. It's such a harsh lesson.
That you just can't buy development off the shelf.
You can't. And then there's the human cost. You hear myths about Japanese lifetime employment, but the sources say the Meiji labor market was just chaos.
Yeah, that lifetime employment thing is a post-World War II invention. Really.
Totally. In the Meiji, the conditions were brutal,
And they're the
especially the Russo-Japanese War. Japan had to borrow astronomical sums of money from banks in London and New York to fund that war.
so if they had lost.
If they had lost, the debt would have crushed the economy. Japan could have easily lost its sovereignty. They won, and it proved they were a first-class nation. But the financial hangover from that debt lasted for decades.
There seems to be a psychological hangover too. I want to bring up the novelist Natsume Soseki. He gave this lecture that really critiques the whole era.
Oh, Saseki is essential for understanding the mood of the time. He used this powerful metaphor. He said that Western development was endogenous.
Meaning it grew from within.
Right, like a flower blooming naturally from its own stem. But he said Japan's development was exogenous. It was forced from the outside. External pressure was creating a national nervous breakdown.
That's a heavy thought. It really challenges the idea that economic growth is always, purely a good thing.
It reminds us that development isn't just about GDP, it's about identity.
So if we pull all this together, the Edo Foundation, the specific way they adapted technology like Yamanobe did, and the incredible costs they paid, what's the big takeaway for us today?
I think the lesson of Japan's development is the death of best practices.
So interesting.
We're always told in business or in policy to look for best practices and just copy them. Japan proves that doesn't work. If Yamanobe had used British best practices, he would have failed.
Because his context, his access to capital and labor was totally different.
Exactly. The real superpower isn't copying, it's translation. It's looking at a new idea or a new technology and asking, how do I take the core of this and reshape it to fit my reality, my resources, my culture, my constraints? That's what Japan did better than anyone else.
So whether you're a developing nation or just a person trying to learn a new skill, don't just copy the manual.
Rewrite it to fit you.
That's a great place to leave. Or a person ever truly feel at peace if your growth is constantly driven by the fear of being left behind, rather than from your own internal desire?
That is the question. And maybe that anxiety is just the price of admission to the modern world.
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
We're going to try and crack the code behind one of modern history's biggest economic puzzles, and we'll be using Kenichi Ono's The History of Japanese Economic Development as our guide. Okay, so let's just dive right into the central mystery we're investigating today. How on earth did a feudal, isolated nation transform into a global industrial powerhouse, seemingly overnight? I mean, we're talking about this incredible leap from a samurai society to an industrial giant. It's a feat that honestly baffled the entire world. So to really find the answer, we can't just stick to the usual story, the one about post-19th century modernization. We've got to dig a lot deeper into Japan's past. Now, the common story you always hear credits the arrival of the West, Commodore Perry's black ship sailing in during the 1850s. That's supposed to be the spark. But is that really the whole picture? What our source suggests is that the real story actually started centuries before any of that happened. Okay, so let's hit rewind. We're gonna go way back to the Edo period. We're talking 1603 all the way to 1867, crucial foundations for a modern economy. I mean, look at this list. Political stability, advanced agriculture, unified national markets, a wealthy merchant class, even a high level of education. The groundwork, it turns out, was already there. And this graph right here, it illustrates the point perfectly. I mean, just look at the data. Even before modern machines were in the picture, rice production, which is a great way to measure productivity, was consistently growing faster than the amount of land being farmed. So what does that tell you? It shows a society that wasn't stagnant at all. It was already becoming more productive, more dynamic, all on its own. Okay, so if all those foundations were already in place, then what was it? What made Japan's society so unique? And this leads us to an even deeper question. One that's about the very structure of Japanese history and its geography. So to get a handle on this, we really have to look at Japan's geography. And there's this really fascinating theory from a scholar named Umasao Tadao that helps us build on what we've found so far. Umasao's idea is called the ecological view of history. And honestly, it's a pretty radical take. He argued that if you look at a map, Japan, just like Western Europe, is on the periphery of the huge Eurasian continent. And because of that location, it was basically insulated from constant invasion. This allowed its society to just evolve, cumulatively, without being constantly disrupted. So the takeaway is, Japan wasn't backward at all. Its location just let it develop organically, kind of like Britain did. But of course, not everyone agrees with that. There's always another side, right? You've got other scholars like Tominaga Kenichi who argue the complete opposite. They say Japan's traditional culture was actually a huge obstacle that had to be overcome, and that this created a really deep conflict during its push to modernize. And this debate, this tension between these two ideas, it actually brings us to the core concept that I think, what is that? Well, it's the process of selectively borrowing foreign ideas and systems, but, and this is the important part, then reinterpreting and modifying them to fit the local context, the local needs, and the local values. Think of it like a master chef, right? They take a foreign recipe, but then they expertly swap in local ingredients to create something totally new, totally unique. And Maegawa Keiji puts it perfectly. He said, "The essence of what has been called modernization is the adaptive acceptance of Western civilization under the persistent form of the existing culture."